Node Ireland event #1, and it's amazing the amount of people that have turned out here. Probably an indication that there's a lot of people out there who are really interested in this technology. It's going to be really, really big. It's starting to take hold in different places, different companies around Ireland. We have here tonight a number of Waterford companies. Seems to be one of the places where Node is kind of sprung up. So we've Peter Bond who can't be here tonight. We've got Peter Henry who are here tonight. We've got TSHG who are here tonight as well, who are doing a lot of research in that area. And we've got nearForm, which is Richard and I who started the company. So when we were talking about what kind of subject the speakers would talk about tonight, or deciding what they should talk about, and then looking at the types of people who registered and trying to figure out who's actually done anything on Node, we quickly decided and realised that a very small number of people, I think we've got, I kind of whispered at the door on the way in, I think I found 3 people who were doing Node.
That's awesome, we're booked for speakers in the next one then.
I've cornered 2 of them already.
So good stuff.
What we've tried to do is we've tried to take Node as a topic and as an area that a lot of developers out there would like to get involved in. We're kind of going from the angle that Richard, who's going to talk, Charlie and Payne are not going to deep dive in there. They're going to talk about how they kind of discover Node, what it's good for, and then we're just going to try and get some debate going and open the board to anyone who wants to ask questions. The first speaker tonight.
Maybe just jump in there quickly.
Yep.
The hashtag for anybody who wants to tweet is Node.js Dublin, and if you want internet access on the right, you'll see our Wi-Fi and password. That's it.
Cool. And actually, another thing is the Node.js Dublin website. We're recording all the talks tonight. Anyone who want to be here, they can get to see the talks and stuff. And everyone who's supportive and interested in this community and this new kind of endeavour, I guess, if you support it, it's going to grow and it's going to take over and stuff. So, first speaker.
Okay, one more thing. Engineers are looking for a Node.js contractor. Here's my motivation. Okay, that's it. Get in touch.
So the first speaker tonight, anyway, is my partner in crime, Richard.rodger, who's written a book recently on Node and writing mobile applications in JavaScript. Yeah.
Thanks very much to Eamon and Engineer and Keith for the intro. Kean knows who the 3 people are, but can everyone who has used Node put their hands up, and you get a job straight away.
Fine used.
Hello world. Written more than 3 lines. And who is intending to use it? Great. So, what I'm going to do for you is give you an introduction to Node and kind of answer the question, why now? Why has Node suddenly arisen? What's it part of? What are the bigger trends that are going on? My personal story around Node.js started off a couple of years back, having done Java for too many years and just having it hurt my brain too much. I decided that really I just preferred to program in some scripting language on the server side. And for me, I don't know, for some reason I gravitated toward JavaScript, and the only choice really at the time was Rhino running on Java. And I kind of helped build a company around that, which has since, Pete Henry, which has since moved on to Node.js. Rhino on Java is terribly slow. But the experience of doing that and the power that comes from using a scripting language on the server side kind of convinced me that it was the right way to go. a couple of years later, when I had to deliver a 6-month project in about 2 months, and I think Node was on version 0.2 or 0.3 at that time, I said, right, I'm going to jump into this now, figure out how to do the asynchronous code. And kind of from a standing start with the Node APIs and way of thinking, was able to actually turn that around. And it wasn't a death march, it was actually fun. And the result at the end of it wasn't something that just barely scraped by, it was something that actually did something real. So for me, it was a really powerful experience. So I'm going to jump in pretty quickly and kind of cover the key things about Node that really count. I don't know, how many of you have read, when Google first brought out the Chrome browser, they brought out this kind of comic book as well that sort of explained how it worked. I don't know if any of you read that or seen it. One of the things they explained was how the V8 JavaScript engine worked. And it had 3 really, really cool features. Taken from the JVM world, it compiled machine code, did generation of garbage collection, and had a really fantastic innovation specifically for JavaScript, where it took JavaScript objects and created virtual classes. And that let you do a whole bunch of really cool magic around optimizations and stuff like that, because instead of doing a whole bunch of dynamic lookups, resolving functions and all that sort of stuff was a lot faster. The other thing that it did was it allowed you to embed the V8 engine. That was one of the design characteristics that the guys had kind of come up with at the start. And a guy called Ryan Dahl, who sort of invented Node.js, was on a sort of a career break, traveling around South America, I think, messing around with this stuff, and decided to build a server-side JavaScript engine using V8. And the result of that was Node.js. And one of the key insights that he had was, if you looked at existing servers that were based around this concept of being event-driven rather than thread-driven, and there were existing ones for Python and Ruby and even Java, the problem was all of the infrastructure for those languages wasn't really event-driven. And what I mean by that is the code itself for a lot of the libraries is blocking the code. So if you make a database call, you have to wait for the database to respond before your code continues. Or if you load a file, that sort of thing. The idea with event-driven servers is that you don't have to wait. Your code doesn't wait. Instead, you get an event back, and when you get the event back, then you do your work. And it's a very successful concept. You can see that in web servers like Nginx, which has recently become the 2nd most used in the world. And he took that insight and applied it to the system that he built around V8 for JavaScript. And that's why Node.js is highly performant. But it's also why you have to kind of learn to think in terms of callbacks, which is a different programming model, really. And it's one of the things that you kind of have to get used to when you really get into Node programming. And it is a hurdle. It is slightly more difficult to code in, but it is worth it because you can do a lot more with a lot less. So this is the only slide I have that shows code, but I did want to just give you a feel for what the code written in Node.js looks like. And the essential characteristic of this code is the function callback. So you're creating a HTTP server, and when request comes in, that anonymous callback function gets called every time. That's kind of the heart of the system, the heart of the idea. The other interesting thing about this is it borrows an idea from systems like Mongo. Instead of a web server being a server that you run that interacts with the file system that has to be configured, the Node.js idea is a server is just another library, it's just another module that you run in whatever way you want. So you can get rid of all sorts of additional infrastructure that you don't need. What that means is Nginx and Node.js together are a perfect way to do static serving with Nginx and the API for your service with Node.js, because you can define your API endpoints, whether they be REST endpoints or, God love you, SOAP or something like that, very easily using Node.js code. And the amount of code that you have to write is very much lower. So key thing is to understand why this is happening. Why now? Why is this suddenly taken off? Why do you have haters on one side and fanboys on the other? Where's there all this heat and energy around Node.js? Event-driven servers are not a new idea. In fact, it's one of the very first programming models. JavaScript is not a new language. It's been around for ages. It's sort of universally derided for being ugly and having loads of warts on it. So I have a kind of theory about what's going on at the moment. And I'm going to put this into a sort of a historical context. I'm going to propose that there have been kind of 3 eras so far in recent history. And I won't go back any further because I wasn't really old enough to understand anything before that. In the 90s, when the whole web thing was taking off, you had one kind of approach to how you build servers. In the first part of this century, that developed into things like Web 2.0 and a more advanced approach based around things like Java. And in this decade, things have changed again with the advent of cloud computing and the fact that when you build a system, it has to serve so many more users than systems that you built 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And this, I think, provides the historical context to understand why Node.js and why now. The key sort of thing about this is to answer the question, what programming language can you program in without getting fired? Right? And if you look at this historical context, in the 90s you could say that that was C or C++. In the early part of the century, Java. And the proposition is, this decade, it's going to end up in JavaScript. And that's for a number of reasons, and I'll go through them. But I think the assertion is that by the end of this decade, JavaScript, for all its issues and for all its ugliness, in one sense would have won this particular era. So, one of the key drivers that's causing this is something known as the C10K problem, which is how do you serve 10,000 concurrent users? And it's something that you can really only do properly with an event-driven server. And the need to do it has only risen in this day. And again, putting it in historical context, in the 90s, really you were already talking about serving low numbers of users. In the Web 2.2 era, that started to grow. And now, if you start off a successful startup and you get into the Facebook ecosystem or one of the large social network ecosystems, you grow very, very quickly. And you have to be able to handle growing scale extremely fast. I'm not asserting that these are exact numbers. These are more about order of magnitude increases over time. So, the other thing that is impacting the adoption of Node is, I suppose, a common approach to how you scale. And again, drawing a broad swathe over what's been going on for the last 20 or 30 years. Scaling started off by just having multiple processes. The original Apache server just ran more processes. You just started up more and more Perl processes to service CGI requests. After that came the threading era, where you had JVMs that could provide you with tons and tons of threads, and that was meant to provide you with more and more concurrency. And I think we've moved back, in a sense, to an era that's based around eventing. And the key thing is that event-driven models have a much lower impact on the resources of the machine, the memory, and the CPU requirement. They're not as heavy, they don't need to be managed as much. And it does lead to a different programming model. But of course, Node.js, being event-driven, fits into that movement and the requirement to serve more with less. So, I just want to step back for a minute to kind of provide an explanation for asynchronous code versus synchronous code, or non-blocking code versus blocking code. A threading model relies on threads sharing time with each other. And one of the ways to think about this is something known as the dying philosopher's problem. So you have 5 philosophers, they're all trying to eat spaghetti, and they only have 5 forks between them. So when a philosopher wants to eat spaghetti, he has to pick up 2 forks and eat, and the 2 philosophers beside him can't. So they have to coordinate something. And then the threading model, the way you do that is you provide each philosopher with a given amount of time to do their eating. But of course, you end up with things like deadlocks and race conditions and things like that if they don't get it right. A simplistic way of looking at event-driven servers is to say, forget about trying to do complex stuff. Just introduce a central loop that simply tells each philosopher in turn when they're supposed to eat. And that's it. So you introduce a butler into the dinner, and you're done. It does mean that the way that you do concurrency is different from the mental models that a lot of people would have learned in college or in practice around threading. And one of the sort of mental blocks that people sometimes have in Node.js is to even understand how it can be concurrent when you only have one thread ever, and only one line of code at a time is ever executed. You never have to worry about sharing state. It's because each piece of your logic runs in turn, and it only does a very small thing before it ends up waiting for the network, or waiting for the database, or waiting for the disk. One of the things that happens if you come from a .NET world or a Java world when you start writing Node.js code is you find yourself worrying about concurrency. And then you suddenly realize, I don't actually have to worry about this. This list is never going to be interfered with by other parts of the code concurrently. And it does make some things a lot easier because of that. The other thing about Node.js that's unavoidable is the fact that you're writing in JavaScript. If the world was a different place, a better place, it wouldn't be JavaScript. I think there's very few people who would actually want to write in this language. And if you look at the genesis of the language and how it was developed in Netscape by Brendan Eich in the space of a couple of weeks in an incredible hurry, you can kind of understand that it was a case of just get something up and running really fast. The language itself, throughout these historical eras, has progressed. And in the 90s, everything that anybody could say about JavaScript was inherently bad, and it was a bad language, and it was a terrible language to work with. It became a lot better when things like jQuery started to emerge. And it became a lot better when it started to standardize properly, and when the major browser vendors started to work together. And now what you're finding is that with the advent of Node.js, and with the advent of a whole bunch of different devices and browsers, there's a huge movement towards standardization of JavaScript, proper implementations that run really fast, advocates like Douglas Crockford who kind of explain how to use JavaScript in a sensible way. So JavaScript as a language choice has gone from being something that's painful, and if you had started doing web development in the 90s, that would have been your experience. It has gone from being something painful to something that is far more pleasant and far more enjoyable. That said, client-side development is always going to be tricky because you have to deal with the user. But it is, on the server side, a lot more fun to code in JavaScript on Node.js than it is to code in Java or .NET. One of the things that I would recommend if you're looking to get into Node.js and to use it seriously is to read JavaScript the Good Parts by Douglas Crockford. He was one of the first advocates to kind of recognize that JavaScript itself, because it's inherently functional, you can take a subset of the language and keep the good parts and just work with those. And then you have a workable language, and a language that doesn't cause you problems. So with a bit of discipline, you can tame the ugliness and the problems of JavaScript. And his site and his book are really required reading if you want to get into this world. The other thing that's driving this movement towards JavaScript and Node.js is the way that you host web applications. And again, if you look at the historical context, you moved from dedicated co-located servers to cloud servers, finally to things that really look after everything for you. So companies like Engineer provide a service which wraps up all of the admin stuff that you had to do before, and you can focus entirely on the code. And at that point, it doesn't really matter what the language is, because of all the performance stuff you kind of outsource to somebody else. And as a result, you can make language choices. You can choose scripting languages, whereas before you really had to choose compiled languages. The other thing that's driving this, in addition to all those server-side considerations, is HTML5 and the more dynamic web that we're seeing today, and the mobile web, things like that. My take on this is that what has happened is when the browser ecosystem was very small, and there was only a few browsers on the desktop, there was no impetus to prevent divergence of the browsers, divergence of the language, divergence of the APIs. What's happened now, there's been a divergence of clients, where you have different types of Android browsers, and iPhone, and Windows Phone 7, and you still have to look at the desktop, is that the divergence of clients has actually led to convergence around the standards. And that's because nobody can afford, unlike Microsoft earlier on, to go their own way anymore. There are just too many different devices to target. And if you bend the rules too much, your particular platform is going to get left behind. And it's sort of an emergent property of the mobile web and what's happening with devices. One of the things that you'll notice, and this is more just an FYI, when you start building stuff with Node.js, is that most of your JavaScript development is still on the client side. And the amount of server-side code that you have to write is much, much smaller. And if you look at the code volumes compared to, say, Java or .NET or something else, you can get a lot more done because you have to write less code. Don't make the mistake of assuming that the style of code that you write on the client side is the style of code that you write on the server side. They're actually extremely different. If you look at the client side, you have, these days, MVC frameworks, well, possibly MVC frameworks, things like Backbone and different frameworks that try to look after the interactions on the client side. And the code that you write with them is very heavy. And there's a lot of state management, there's a lot going on. On the server side, because you're tending to write APIs that are just serving JSON or XML, specifically to your requests, because a lot of the complexity is hidden in modules that you use, your server-side code tends to be much more straight down the line. Because you're not going to do huge amounts of computation with Node.js anyway, code paths tend to be quite simple. And the whole issue of managing things like callbacks isn't quite as bad as it seems. A lot of people criticize Node.js, and there's a lot of benchmark fights and that sort of stuff. It's important to understand what it does in reality, and what people are actually, people who write it and people who use it are actually claiming that it does. It's not meant to be the absolute fastest web server out there. It's not meant to be used for high-intensity computation. It is meant to be used for services that need to service a lot of users. Services that are I/O bound, that are database bound, that are network bound. In one sense, you can think of it as a glue that pulls together all of these different services. And a good example would be, if you have a search function on your site, you would use something like Solr to actually do the indexing and search. But Node.js would mediate between the search requests and the Solr engine itself. You wouldn't write a search engine as such in Node.js, but it would help you deliver search functionality in your project extremely quickly. If you read all the blogs, again, the haters and the fanboys, especially at the moment, there's huge fights around benchmarking, micro benchmarks, and this new Java server is faster than Node. That one is faster, and Node is faster if you do this. It's all true and it's all lies at the same time. The benchmarking thing isn't really as important as it seems. The thing about Node.js is that it's good enough. When you think about it, this is a dynamic scripting language that is in the same competitive ballpark as highly tuned Java JVMs that have been around for 15 years, or C++ servers. What it allows you to do is, instead of writing all of this legacy code in Java and things like that, to build your systems using a much simpler scripting language, and that's a huge win. And what does it matter if you're losing 10 or 20% in a performance benchmark? It's still good enough. The key thing, really, about Node.js, and this is the real answer to the question, why should I use it, is that it accelerates whatever you're trying to do. It provides you with an innovation advantage. The thesis of this diagram, and this isn't my diagram, it was developed by a guy called Bruno Fernandez-Ruiz, is that ultimately, when you reach a mature system, the amount of engineering effort and the amount of time that takes is pretty much the same whatever language you use. But what matters in the early days is the shape of those curves. And the key takeaway from this is that you get to proof of concept much sooner. Yes, after that, with JavaScript, you're going to have to expend a lot of effort making sure that it's robust. You get that robustness up front with strongly typed language because you're doing a lot of inherent type checking, that sort of thing. But if you're building an MVP, if you need to deliver a project really, really quickly, if you want to get a cloud service up and running, minimum effort with a smaller number of engineers, Node.js can deliver on that. If you subsequently need much faster performance or more robustness, that's the time to start thinking about Erlang or something like that. And that, I think, is one of the key reasons to use Node.js. So I'll leave you with one last thought about the brave new world that you're going to face. If you hate JavaScript, it's time really to feel zen about it because it isn't going away. And Node.js is probably the best that can be made of a very strange legacy language with a lot of bad parts. But I think if you focus on the good parts, it can be extremely effective. Thank you very much.
Yeah, does anybody have any questions? We're a little bit behind on time, so kind of keep like 5, 6, 7 minutes of questions. Come on.
I'm going to count down. There we go.
So, I have no experience in Node, and actually I haven't done much JS here. Yeah, sorry about that. But I kind of had the impression that, or at least at the beginning, you talked about capability to scale as well, right?
Yes.
That's what you said. But then now at the end, in the diagram, you said, well, if you want to build code like pretty fast, do it in this. If you worry about performance, in my mind, that's about fully scaling. Does that not contradict?
It's the scale of your scaling that counts. It only matters when you're getting to hundreds of millions of users. Okay. Node.js can get you to at least 10 million users. At that point, I think you have so many resources that it doesn't really matter what language you're going to use. The key point here is that if you're a small team, a team that is the size of almost all teams, engineering teams, Node.js can deliver the scalability. Okay. Scale or scale? Any more?
Promised Ian that I'll bring this up. I think yours is the talking is to ask this question. When I first saw Node, it was 2009, the first full frontal conference. Simon Willison blew everybody's mind, saying, you can use JavaScript on your database to render your views, to generate your views in CouchDB. You can use Node.js to render your pages. You can use JavaScript then to do on the client side. Those who know me know that I'm a fan of web standards and progressive enhancement. What's going on in that area in terms of actually writing a lot less code? Because that's what we were promised, essentially. You have this Node.js, you're going to write one piece of code and you're going to have have the same stuff happening on client side and
Yeah,
server side.
yes.
And that didn't actually happen other than if you try to Google progressive enhancement Node.js, you get the Todd Glass videos from YYConf 2010. You also get Yahoo's Mojito, but with Yahoo's recent troubles. It's a little bit, of a gamble to buy into Mojito, whether it's going to be kept up, whether it's going to be kept up to date, whether it's going to be developed and all of that. You take a look at developer forums for that. Once again, Mojito is not very popular. And everybody's sort of going, yeah, let's build all these one-page apps. Let's use hashbang URLs, or some of the more cautious people only use for stage. So what's going on on the progressive enhancement sphere of all of that, and what am I missing?
So I think there was a lot of naive optimism about it's the same language on the client and the server. I think the forces on the client and the server are very, very different. You write a lot less code on the server compared to other traditional languages. But the type of apps that we're writing these days, if you're writing them on the client, it has to be JavaScript anyway, whatever your backend is. And that volume of JavaScript is going up. And that's why you're seeing all of these MVC frameworks. Development on the client side has become much more like something like Java Swing was back in the day, where you have to manage all of this state and interaction. And that's a challenge, I think, that the web standards working groups have to meet. And you can see some ham-fisted attempts to meet it in things like delivering the right image sizes depending on whether you have a retina display or not. There was a big fight about that last week. Look, the promise of HTML back in the day was that it was a declarative syntax. And you can see people trying to keep that spirit alive in things like jQuery Mobile, where you use attributes to control your UI. But then you have other people like Sencha saying, well, just forget about that. Let's just use code, because that's what it's all about. And the HTML end of it sort of subsides. I think Node.js is orthogonal to the question of how do we build JavaScript clients. And that's an unanswered question. I think that's very difficult and should be recognized, because we're building interactive software in an environment that has been forced into.
Would you say one of the advantages of the language is the fact that it has such a historic and bad name, in so much as a lot of languages that people use nowadays are syntactically correct or scientifically correct or best practice correct, whereas JavaScript actually gives you the opportunity or enforces on the fact that, hey, things aren't that good, and in the real world, things generally aren't that good. And do you think that philosophy has any sort of bearing on the uptake of Node.js and the way that people should start defining the way that they go about making applications? It's not so much two fingers up to sort of the academic computer science aspect of what we do, but it's more about actually computer science is relevant, but actually there's the real day-to-day code aspect of it, just getting things done.
Exactly. The conundrum that's faced is that we're stuck with a QWERTY keyboard instead of one that has the vowels in the right place. And a language like Google's Go or Clojure or something like that is a better language. And if we could use it across the board, we would all be more productive. But the problem is you have this vast volume of legacy code out there in JavaScript, and it's just not going away. And JavaScript is just now embedded in the technology landscape. So part of the message here is you have to learn from people like Douglas Crockford about making the best of the language. And if you're serious about using Node.js to build applications, and you haven't ever formally trained yourself in JavaScript, you haven't actually sat down and gone through the language itself, you've just picked it up by osmosis because you had to build it and you had to validate forms and you had to do a bit of jQuery, you will trip up. The time investment in going back to basics with JavaScript and learning some of the nuances of the language and how to do functional programming with JavaScript will pay off. One of the first challenges you have in Node.js is dealing with errors. Throwing exceptions it doesn't really work in the way that you would expect it to. For the most part, Node.js libraries will give you an error object as the first parameter that is returned. And in a lot of beginner code, you'll see huge amounts of if statements